Going. All right, this is a 51 Vets case study. I am speaking with Chris Grillo, who spent over 10 years in the SEAL teams, and then after got out, did his MBA at Wharton, actually during the last 2 years of your active duty time. And then afterwards, you spent, your post-military career working within private equity-backed companies. So this is really like a transition case study for those who are interested in going into private equity-backed companies and ops roles. So what I'll do is actually share my screen and kind of look at your LinkedIn profile. And Chris, if it's cool, let's just kind of do a walkthrough of that, starting off with this amazing profile picture that you have. That's just that hair, that jaw, Chris. Awesome. Um,
Make
so
it blush.
just give you a little background, like where are you from and like how many years were you active, and then just kind of walking through your transition story.
Yeah, absolutely. So, born in Michigan, but grew up in Florida for most of my life. Ended up going to the Naval Academy kind of post 9/11. Saw obviously what we all experienced, and kind of a driver for me to find a way to serve. Got lucky enough to get to the academy, and then try to figure out what I wanted to do, and quickly kind of gravitated to trying to pursue a career in the SEAL community. Graduated from there, went straight out to Buds, and then spent the next 5-year plan that really turned into 13, which I'm
Yeah.
super glad it did. But spent 13 years on the active duty side, first on the West Coast, then since time on the East Coast, and then the last couple of years in DC, in a officer community manager position, which allowed me to also go knock on my MBA before I then decided now was the time to try something different and transition out of active duty. Still in the reserves to this day, so trying to make that work. And it's a much different world, but glad to be part of that. And then
Yeah.
from
Well, let's talk
yeah.
about your MBA. Like, what type of MBA program did you do at Wharton? Was it full-time executive? Like, what were you doing?
Yeah, it was the executive MBA from Wharton. So while I was living in DC, I was commuting up to Philly every other weekend. Quite the grind. I mean, it's my wife jokes, it was deployments would probably have been easier because you come home and have dinner with the family, and then from like 8 to midnight you're doing schoolwork, or at least I had to do it to stay competitive with that group, and then spending the weekends up in Philly doing the course curriculum. And that went for a full 2 years, May to May of 19 when it wrapped up. But great program. I think depending on where you're at in your career and what you're thinking about, and when you're getting out of the military, whether an MBA makes sense. For me, it would open some doors that I think would have been difficult to get otherwise. But I also have now been on the other side where business opportunity or business experience and reps are really super valuable, and you get a little bit of exposure at business school, but it doesn't compete for being on the ground in a business in some capacity.
So then after B school ended in 2019, what was your first job that you got out?
So I went to Partners Group, which is a private equity firm. For me, the plan was, as I was kind of going through business school, obviously a good network there doesn't compare to the military network. Honestly, our military network is so much better and so much broader. But that said, made the decision, hey, I want to go into private equity, and realized I had to narrow that down. At first, I was kind of really open to anything and everything. And I think I had one network call where the guy's like, I don't know how to help you because you're not giving me enough clarity on the industry or role you want to do. So then I had to kind of come to terms and say, all right, let me pick something where I think I want to end up, and focus my network discussions and learning more about the industry. So it kind of went from finance to like PE or VC, to then private equity, to then I want to be on the investment side in private equity, and understanding what it takes to get there. And what I learned was it's typically, the buds or boot camp of private equity is typically investment banking. And I said, well, I don't want to do that. And I'd rather not be in New York, Chicago, some of the big financial hubs. And so spent time.
When you were transitioning, like for during this, how old were you? What was kind of family situation?
Yeah, gosh, how old I was. I mean, I have Today I've got a 16-year-old and 9-year-old. So, back that up 5 years, and kids that were school age and pretty young. Um,
Yeah.
my wife's a writer, and fortunate she can do that at home. So have a good support network there that facilitates some more flexibility that not everyone has. But
But
so
the 90, 80, 90, 100 hour weeks as an associate post MBA was not going to fit for the family situation.
yeah, I was prepared to do that because as I learned and understood that most paths go through that, particularly if you want to be in the investment side. And now being on the other
Yeah.
side of things, I can see why for good reason, and happy to give my perspective there. So I was willing, but wanted to see if there was a way to, I guess, circumvent it, and was fortunate enough to find that through Partners Group, which is, people don't know, it's about 150 billion AUM, pretty large PE shop, about 1,800 people globally. And they had the thesis at this time of taking non-traditional candidates, bringing them in and teaching them how to become investors. And so that was my kind of loophole, if you will, that allowed me to kind of skip banking, jump into straight into private equity. In this case, their North American headquarters was based out of Denver, where I'm still at today. So that was also another check in the box that wasn't a big city like New York or Chicago.
Yeah. And what were you doing when you started? Like, were you in, I know a handful of private equity firms have almost like a leadership rotational program.
You got it. Yeah.
But what were you doing? What was the first kind of 3 to 6 months like?
Yeah, so I entered it. It was a global cohort of about 50, but in the US, there was about 18 of us that were joining. Everyone had an MBA, and that's where I kind of highlight that. I'm not sure I would have gotten the spot if I didn't have that. Granted, most of that group was about 8 years my junior, so different stages in life and different experiences. But I came in there as a rotational program. They kind of placed people first initially based on where the best fit was, and I ended up in a kind of our operational team, which just made sense given my background.
How
And
big was the ops team?
so I would say there was probably about, call it 20, 25 folks across that team. And at the time, it was a single team that focused on our private equity investments, our infrastructure investments, and advising our debt investments. That structure changed a couple of years later, but started off in that operational capacity where you're working with portfolio companies we've acquired and doing diligence on potential investment opportunities. And ultimately got some investment reps. But what I quickly saw is I like the operating side. I could, add value a lot faster as I learned the business and learned about the industry. I also helped out a boss of mine who was a Navy veteran himself, who understood my background and gave me a lot more opportunities and leeway than I think my peer groups got, or I would have gotten in another role. So felt lucky in that regard. As I got some
So
reps.
you found an internal champion who got your background and
Yeah.
understood where you could be placed.
Yep, you've got it. And so it was quickly throwing me into portfolio companies kind of independently. And I know that would have been tough to find those opportunities. Not everyone's, a lot of people are big veteran champions. Not everyone understands how to leverage them. And I was fortunate enough to have an advocate who did.
It's awesome. So then, um, how long were you in that role at the partners group level before you went into a portfolio company? Because you were at partners just over 5 years. Like, how long were you at partners doing investing role before you like actually went to the PortCo?
Yeah, absolutely. It was about, let's see, 6 months of kind of that initial at the portfolio companies, or doing select projects until I did my first embedded role. And then even after that, I stepped into some investing roles after my first embedded role. But ultimately, my 5 years at Partners Group was a mix of that, call it operating partner role versus embedding into portfolio companies essentially as a full-time employee. So I got that exposure through two separate pilot programs the firm was trying out. Kind of raised my hand on both occasions to do those. One was a year in duration, another ended up being a year and a half. And great exposure, because it's a very different world of operating partner, kind of a FID mission, working by with and through management teams to grow the business, versus being essentially a PE-backed portfolio company employee, where you're singularly focused on one business, and trying to improve that business.
What did you think about, in retrospect, if you had to kind of do that over with the knowledge that you know now, would you advise people to kind of stay at the firm level, or did you get more learning, faster learning, and just overall more satisfaction from being at the PortCo?
That's tough because there's both sides of it where I think are valuable and then different reasons to consider. One on the fund side, the operating partner side, you're kind of playing with multiple hands of cards. You get to work with multiple portfolio companies. You get a lot more exposure across different industries than you would if you're with a singular portfolio company. So that's nice. You're not going as deep on those businesses though to really build I think the business acumen you want to have as you get more senior. Also on
Because
the
you're going across you're servicing the whole portfolio. And
it wouldn't necessarily be the whole portfolio. We try to be pretty discreet and say, all right, you can't sit across 6 different businesses and really have a deep knowledge. You can sit across 2 to 3, maybe 4, and be pretty engaged and be around to actually help the management team execute some strategic projects. So we try to keep it pretty just kind of defined to call it,
yeah,
2 to 3 businesses. The other piece though on the fund side is this, there aren't a lot of operating partner roles in the PE ecosystem. Yeah, I've heard you call it 11,000 PE firms out there. I would venture to say 98% don't really have an operational capability. I think that's changing, and you're seeing more firms with organic operating capabilities. But just the way funds are set up and available capital for headcount, you don't see a lot of PE firms with operators. They may have board
and
advisors.
especially unlike on the investment side, where you have junior, mid, and senior roles,
Yeah,
if they have a true value creation team for the operating partner function or the operations function, it's very senior. Like
you
I'm going
got
to
it.
pull the 20-year vet who is at Danaher Corporation or who
Yeah.
is at Toyota or General or GM. I'm going to pull that 20-year vet to go work across my portfolio, not, a 28-year-old engineer who might have been. But I think that that's changing significantly as the private equity firms have to build out their value creation teams and the
Yeah.
depth of those teams in true value creation roles, not investment roles.
I agree, and it's a few things, right? That senior role, right? They show up with a contact list of people that they know in the industry. They've got the experience and credibility to sit across from a management team and say, I've been there. So there's a lot of reasons why it makes sense for that senior focus. I agree that that's changing. My time at Partners Group, the thesis was we took in junior folks. I was kind of one of them, but we actually moved away from that because it was harder to get junior folks the consistent reps they would need to grow their operating skills. Better to grab someone from McKinsey or Bain who are getting that more regularly and bring them in at mid-level or just hire at that senior level. So we even went from a broader focus of operators to, all right, we're not gonna bring in anyone say less than 10 years of industry experience and then senior.
Yeah. And then when you went to one of the portcos, which was called USIC, which was a Partners Group portco. Like, first, what is USIC, and what did you do there? Kind of going from, I think you started off as a director of project management office and chief of staff, VP of quality operations, then VP of operations slash the GM of the West Division. Like, walk us through that first role that you had as the director of, in the project management office or the chief of staff. And you were there for
Yeah,
nine
so this
months.
was this was one of the first pilots Partners Group was looking exploring with the thesis of let's take more junior individuals, both from the operating side and the investing side, stick them into portfolio companies for typically a 6-month duration to get them that exposure to understand how management teams think and operate. And so I said, hey, I'll raise my hand and do that. The business USIC at the time had kind of plateaued in its performance. We were bringing in a new CEO from the board, and I was coming in at that same time. So came in there in that chief of staff capacity and also running the project
What does that
management.
mean, chief of staff, within because it's such a new term
Yeah,
within private equity portcos. You see it a little bit more like maybe on like the venture portcos or in the venture ecosystem, like in the professional services world, but I don't really see it as much on like in the private equity world and the portcos. So what does
Yeah,
that
I mean,
actually, what is a private equity portco chief of staff? What do you do?
yeah, of course it definitely varies. Harvard Business Review actually has a good article that kind of frames into three different levels. On the lower end, it's essentially like an executive assistant, and on the high end, it's more kind of like the military. It's the chief of the staff there. When the CEO is not around, chief of the staff is still driving that. You know, admittedly for me, it was kind of more in between, kind of between that two and three. You know, just given my tenure in the industry, I wasn't all the way up at a three, but kind of evolved to that. And it was working with that CEO who had a clear goal and strategy of what the business needed to do, working with the rest of the management team, the CFO, head of HR, all the other functions to focus on their key projects that were going to grow the business and kind of keep them to task and organized and focused on meeting their milestones when the CEO wasn't around. And so that was when I was kind of a chief of staff slash project management office. That role had existed initially at the firm there, and kind of came in and replaced that individual and kind of took on some of those chief of staff responsibilities, board engagement, those sort of things. So it's a little bit of a jack of all trades, which I think is phenomenal because it gave me a ton of exposure to the different functions. You know, the EHS team, HR, finance, operations. I'm sitting in the meetings with the CEO and other leaders and gave me a ton of exposure. And frankly, my subsequent embedded role was a byproduct of having that chief of staff opportunity. So I think good chief of staff roles are stepping stones to business unit leadership positions within an organization or within an industry. So I think it's
Yeah.
for veterans looking to get into PE world or PE backed businesses. Chief of staff can be a great stepping stone as long as there's clear definition around what that is.
I love that. And I think that's actually one of the things that 51 vets that we need to do is almost like create a a group of our members who really understand the role and are ready to be plugged into private equity portcos. And then we need to message that to the private equity community, like, hey, here's their background, here's the role that they will fulfill for you. You have $2 to $15 million of EBITDA. Here's what they're going to do within the executive team to support the either CEO or the broader executive team that is often developing, especially you're talking about three to sub 10 million of EBITDA, that executive team is really developing. What do you see as kind of like the biggest role of a chief of staff?
I think it's kind of akin to the way the military uses it, and it's the chief of the staff. You're holding the rest of the management team accountable, keeping them focused on their discrete projects that are really going to move the needle for the business. You're preventing scope creep or distractions with other stuff, and then keeping them kind of time bound, those kind of smart goals, so that they're meeting the expectations that are set before them. And it's
Yeah.
something that I really didn't appreciate at the time. I assumed that stepping into, from the military into the executive world, you would have a group of executives. Everyone is super talented, hardworking, driven. By all means, you definitely have that, but that's not ubiquitous across the industries I've had experience with. And so it takes some leadership and holding people accountable and kind of driving, pushing people to be passionate and focus on
How
helping
does
grow the
that role
business.
fit into, yeah, but how does that role fit into the executive team of a company with 5 million of EBITDA?
Yeah.
Is that I mean, isn't that the CEO's role or isn't that the COO's role? Like, how do you fit into that?
Yeah, so we didn't have a COO, and that was probably some of the dynamic. But I think a piece of it was that allowed me to I got some quick credibility and trust by the CEO. He said Chris is going to help you do this, and work through him. And I was kind of the filter, so not everyone's coming straight to the CEO and just bombarding him with information requests. I'm helping kind of keep that organized, solving the problems I can at my level, and then determining what gets elevated to the CEO, making sure it's stuff that if stuff's if the CFO wants to elevate something that's not part of our strategy that we've been clear about and clearly articulated, then I'm trying to stop it there. So it keeps the CEO focused and the management team focused on truly what the most accretive initiatives are.
So kind of fast forwarding to the last maybe 6 to 12 months when you're at that PortCo, what were you doing in that kind of final role at that Partners Group PortCo?
Yeah, so I wound down that embedded role, that first pilot, and we started doing it pretty consistently at our other portfolio companies with peers of mine. I went back, I spent some time on doing some debt financing just to try to get some finance reps and kind of back to my traditional operating partner role. As that second role was approaching, I was actually in the process of defining our operator career path and working with our teams and our leadership on what that looks like. And I talked a little bit about that, how we shifted focus away from bringing in junior folks and focused on mid-level and senior operators in the organization. And part of that kind of strategy was taking operators and sticking them into portfolio companies for longer durations, what we refer to as a long-term secondment, call it 1.5 to 2 years in duration. And just coincidentally, that same CEO I had previously worked with was making some operational changes and asked if I would come back and take over. In this case, there was kind of one operator that was running the entire company. It was just a little bit too much, and it was going to break into 3 divisions. And so I came in as the general manager of the West Division, about 4,000 employees across 18 states, a $400 million P&L, something that there was at that point in my career, no way I could have stuck my resume in that stack of candidates and gotten that job. It was solely because of that time in that chief of staff role, because I had experience and built credibility and trust with that CEO that he asked if I would come step into that role. So again, I kind of pound the table on the chief of staff roles as a good entry point, which can lead to much greater levels of responsibility.
So in a little bit over 4.5 years, you went from chief of staff for the PortCo to the GM of the West Division and managing over 400 million of top line and over 3,000 people.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So then last year, you switched over to Brightstar Capital. What is Brightstar and what are you doing in this new role?
Yeah, so very similar role, with the difference Brightstar is smaller, a smaller firm. So for me, I was winding down that embedded role. I really had a great experience, and I was a little bit conflicted on, do I want to just go find a dedicated portfolio, PE-backed portfolio company to step in as a COO or CEO, or do I want to go back to that traditional operating partner model at the fund level? And kind of through some reflection, realized that I was fortunate enough to be on that fund level to begin with. I talked about how few opportunities I think that are out there. Granted, they're growing, and so wasn't sure if I stepped away from that, if I'd be able to get back in if I decided, oh, in fact, I do want to be at the PE fund level. So said instead, maybe there's some things I want to tweak that will make it a better fit, and namely, it was Partners Group was a big firm making fairly large acquisitions that are companies that are more mature and advanced. Look to a firm that was doing smaller investments where there was more opportunity to really grow the business, not necessarily easier, but more simple initiatives that you could grow the business. I wanted to be more service focused, frankly, akin to my time in the military, which I would describe as industrial service industry, for lack of better description. I like that service component where people are the revenue generators. It's not a technology, it's not a machine per se. People are the revenue generators, roofing businesses, utility service businesses like
So
USIC.
you want to shift the types of company that you were working in.
You got it. Yep. So size and type, and then just looking for different level of leadership. I was a part of an investment team where my leadership were great individuals, but on a kind of diverging career path. They were more traditional bankers turned private equity investors, versus I'm on this operational career path that is in the same ecosystem but a little bit different. And I wanted, as many of us do, to continue to learn and develop. So wanted a leader who would provide that, and really kind of checked those 3 boxes when I got introduced to Brightstar, and that led to my transition last summer to the company.
That's awesome. Maybe kind of taking a big step back when you look at some things that you did well during the transition and things you did not do well. What do you think are some of those things?
One thing I did well, I started about 18 months out when I was, started working in DC. I was in my MBA. It kind of really solidified. All right, now I think is going to be the right time to make that transition. So I felt like it gave me a sufficient enough runway. It's tough because, in the military, at least my experience, you have to quit your job 12 months in advance and you've got nothing lined up. So that could be a little bit stressful, but felt like I had enough runway to get some exposure, had some good networking calls and mentors that helped me focus in on what I wanted to do and continue to refine that. So I think that was well. Now, the reality is I kind of got it wrong. I was super adamant on wanting to be on the PE investment side and ultimately switched away from that. So I would say something I got wrong, but still a great experience, and I'm glad I had that. But overall, leaning on our military network really helped. It was great because I was going to Wharton, and there's some great talented individuals, and made some connections there. Ultimately, the job I got at Partners Group was through a military connection, kind of a network to network connection that I learned about that opportunity. So I think that's a great network to lean on. What's tough is there's not too many, SEALs and private equity Facebook group or stuff out there. So it's funny how many people I got connected to. They'd be like, "Oh, I know another SEAL in PE. Do you know who he is? Never heard of him." But that's just the beauty of networking and making those connections. So those are the kind of few things I think that went well for me, and then some learning points along the way.
Awesome. And if you had one message for the private equity community, the operators at private equity community who are not veterans, what is your message on what leadership is?
I mean, what I've found is on the operating side, there are a lot of great leaders. I think that environment is kind of it cultivates some strong operational leaders who may not have any military experience, but I've, at least in my small microcosm of experiences, found that most of the operators, the PE operators I worked with, were open-minded and flexible. They were receptive to different folks like myself, and so had just really nothing but positive experiences there. I think it's if I were to change your question a little bit, it's on the investing side. The PE world is run by investors. That's just the nature of it. Operators at different firms and different different PE in the different PE worlds are kind of maybe not at parity, maybe more so at parity. And I think my message would be more towards that larger investment population of leveraging operators, bringing in particularly military veterans in various capacities, whether it's at the fund level or at the PortCo level, and challenge them to learn quickly and have an impact on these businesses. And it's frankly, there's some element where no amount of grit and determination can replace business acumen. So it does take some time. I felt like for me, it took about 5 years to really gain some business reps and really start to understand, so I could sit in a room and understand the financial side of a business versus HR or operations. So it does take a little bit of time, and that requires us to be a little bit patient, which can be tough because you want to drive forward and you're hungry, but those reps will come, and you're gonna get supercharged based on the leadership skills that aren't as common in the private sector, paired with that business acumen you start to build is when things quickly take off.
Yeah. All righty. Well, this has been super interesting. I hope it's going to be valuable for the not just the transitioning vets who will hopefully hear it, but also the employers, particularly within private equity, the portfolio companies, just to really understand just the mountain, the gold mine of talent that is in 51 vets and across the broader vet community. So this is awesome. Thanks a lot for doing this, man.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thanks for setting this up, Jordan.
Awesome.